Hi guys, this is Christine from Lockpick Extreme, and today I'm making a video that's been asked for a lot. A video on how to repin a lock. Like I've said to you guys in the past, there are so many different locks out there, and every lock is different. So the lock you're working on might be slightly different, but all the basics I'm giving here on changing out the pins and the internals are going to be pretty universal for a majority of pin tumbler locks. Since this video is going to be one of our longer ones, check out the description box for timestamps and specific steps or topics. Also, check out our online store at lockpickextreme.com/shop to check out the products that I mentioned in this video. Today, as an example, I'm going to be using the practice lock set that we use and sell on our website, since so many of you ask me if they're repinable when you're purchasing them. First, let's go over the tools and some items that you'll need. Obviously, you'll need the lock that you want to repin. Like I said, I have a set here of Lock X's progressive practice locks. After that, you'll need the pins you'll want to swap out. In this case, let's say I want to take my 5-pin lock and make it a bit more of a challenge by switching some of the drivers to security pins and also by adding a stack in the 6th hole. Today my goal is to turn this into a 6-pin with a standard serrated spool, standard serrated lineup. Here's our repinning kit available on our store. It comes with a variety of pins and springs for repinning. A quick note. A lot of times people make progressive practice locks with either serrated or spooled security pins. This is a great way to practice picking security pins. If you're making a set of spooled progressives, it's important to note that if you put all spooled drivers in all of your chambers, the lock will still work. However, at the lock's resting state, you're going to have a lot of slop or movement of the core, since those pins do have that space cut out. To stop this, many people like to include at least one standard, serrated, or any other kind of driver pin without that gap. My next tool is a plug follower. You can buy one of these tools that are made for repinning locks. It's basically a tube with the same diameter as the core. And some of the followers have some really nice features. But what I've been using for years and is extraordinarily cheap is a wooden dowel. You can get a box of 20 wooden dowel pegs at 1/2 inch diameter at the hardware store for just a couple bucks. Just remember, standard household style locks, including our Lock X practice locks, are going to take a 1/2 inch diameter, but other smaller locks such as padlocks may be slimmer. A quick note about these wooden dowels. This one here I've been using for several years and it's had its ends sanded down. Some people will argue that this makes it much easier to work with rather than having the beveled edge that these pegs usually come with. You do not have to sand the ends down if you don't want to. You might have to give the follower a little bit more of a wiggle when working it back into the lock, but it'll work just fine as is out of the package. Next up is some tweezers. In the past, I've gotten away with using beauty and even craft tweezers, but it does help a lot to have proper repinning tweezers. Tweezers made especially for repinning have a contour cut into the tip that match the round pins you're working with. This makes picking up pins a lot easier and prevents slipping. You'll also need something to open the back of the lock you're working on. This can be a wide range of things. The Lock X practice locks have a pin style end cap, which requires you to depress this little pin in the back to be able to unscrew the cap. Another very common type of end cap has a C-clip that pops on and off. If you have a C-clip, a pair of pliers works best. In the case of a pin style end cap, you can purchase a tool that looks something like this. This tool is going to push down on the pin, and when you turn it, it will unscrew the cap in one easy step. These can be a little bit pricey and just another thing to carry around, so what I like to do is use one of my turning tools to get the job done. Really, anything small enough to push the pin down without hitting the sides of the end cap will work. Some of the last items are not necessary, but can make your life a lot easier. Once you open up the lock and remove all the innards, you'll want a place to put them down and keep them organized. Typically, if you just set them down on the table, they're going to get away from you. One of the more fancy options you can go for is something like a pinning mat or a pinning tray. A pinning mat like I have here is a really nice surface to work on. It keeps all your things in one place, and it also protects the table you're working on. Pinning mats and tray have really nice grooves cut out for individual springs and pins. These help keep everything tidy. If you don't have a mat or a tray, there are a ton of other cheap or free options. You can use little Tupperware containers or cups to hold all your springs and pins. One trick I really like is taking a piece of cardboard scrap and ripping off one side of the corrugated middle. The corrugation makes nice grooves that mimic a pinning tray. If all else fails, use a terry cloth piece of towel or washcloth to create a surface that your pins cannot roll off of. So let's get into repinning. One thing I wish I knew before I started repinning my first lock is to make sure that you know which end of the housing, this brass part, is the front and which end is the back. If you're using the LockX practice locks, you can tell because the front of the lock has a very slight angle cut into the Bible here. Not all locks are like this though, so just take a look at the lock and make a mental note. You can put a piece of tape on the front end or use a pencil to mark it. So first we're going to open up this lock. Like I mentioned before, different locks have different methods of keeping everything held together. Our LockX progressive locks have a pin in the back, so I'm going to go ahead and use my turning tool to push that end and twist off the end cap. Again, C-clips are another common style. Many locks also have a removable clip at the top, like seen here. You can remove this clip completely and have access to the entire lock via the top. It's just as a valid way to repin a lock, but I won't be repinning through the top today. But with the information that we're giving you here in this video, you'll probably be able to figure out how to do this. Not all locks have this feature, so I'm going to be showing you the standard or default way. Now that the end cap is off, make sure you hold the lock facing down until you're ready to catch the spring and the pin. Sometimes the spring behind the pin doesn't want to come out easily. If a spring doesn't fall out right away, don't worry. The spring is in there. It just might need a firm tap on a solid surface to become dislodged. We're going to keep the pin and the spring set aside for later. When a lock is at its resting state, the driver pins are blocking the shear line, holding the lock locked. You can check out our other videos in the description below for information on these lock basics. So right now, even though the end cap is off, I'm not able to pull this lock apart because of those driver pins. At this point, I either need to have the key or I need to pick this lock open. When I'm repinning, I like to keep my picking tools on hand, but the LockX Practice Progressive set comes with a set of keys. So go ahead and take your key, simply insert it, and turn it a quarter of the way or 90 degrees. Now that the end cap is off and I have this lock open, I'm ready to remove the core from the housing and access the springs and the pins. Now if I simply just pull this core out, I'm going to get springs and pins flying all over the place. This is where our plug follower, whether a fancy store-bought one or a scrap of wooden dowel, comes in. The key here is to make sure that the lock stays unlocked so that the chamber is split. I have my springs and drivers in this direction here, while my key pins are sitting in the core at a different angle here. This is a critical point and usually where most accidents or mess up happens. I want to make sure that I'm pulling the core out and pushing the follower in without any twisting or without any gap in between the two. If any of the holes in the housing connect with the holes in the core, those springs are going to cause the drivers to snap down and put itself in the locked position. I'm going to place this core aside here, careful not to tip any of the key pins out. If your key pins do fall out, because it does happen to the best of us, you can simply put them back in. But remember, if you still want the key to work, make sure that you insert the key and put the key pins back in so that they're flush with the core. If we put them back in a different order, the key won't work anymore since the key cuts and the key pins work together as a set. Great, now we have the core set aside so we can work on swapping out those driver pins. I'm going to slowly pull out the follower from one end, making sure to keep my thumb over that end to make sure things don't go flying out. These springs may seem small, but they will launch themselves across a room. As I pull the follower out, I can count how many pins are dropping down below by listening. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Everything is out, so I'm carefully going to dump these guys onto my pinning mat. Okay, so I'm going to separate out the standard drivers that were in here, the ones that I don't want to keep. Like I said before, I'm going to add a stack to make this guy a 6-pin lock, so I'm going to be adding one of my springs from this kit. Okay, now that I have this all planned out, I'm going to start repopulating this lock. I'll need my follower again to hold back each of the stacks as I progress forward and fill out the chambers. So here I'm going to start at the front end of the lock. And in this case, these Lock X progressive sets have that notch cut in them, so I know that this end is the front. First, I'm going to drop in a spring in the first chamber. I also want to make sure that the spring is in good condition. If it has an end poking out or it looks mangled, it'll likely get caught up in the shear line and jam the lock. After the spring comes my first driver. As I planned, this is going to be a standard driver. My trick for getting this thing is to hold the top of the driver pin with the tweezers and insert the bottom into the chamber. Once it's halfway in, I'm going to use the plug follower to push forward on it tightly. That should create enough force to hold that pin in place so when I let go of the tweezers, it doesn't go flying off. Perfect. Once I release with the tweezers, I'm going to take my tweezers again and push down on that driver pin while pushing forward with the follower. This will cause the pin to recess all the way into the chamber and allow the follower to cover it up, letting you move on to the next stack. So basically, I'm going to repeat that process for all 6 chambers. Once I'm done with that, I'm going to have the housing with the follower fully back in like this. And at this point, I'm ready to reconnect it with the core. Make sure that you're looking at the front of the housing. Whether you know that by the angle like the Lock X practice locks have, or a mark that you made yourself. And you want to make sure that that front is going to come into contact with the face of the core. You want to make sure that the front here is connecting with the front here. A lot of times, if you try and put it back together backwards, the driver pins won't be able to drop down and the lock won't be able to relock because the chambers are ever so slightly forward and not actually centered on the housing and the core. Now here's another critical point where most mistakes happened. Just like when I pulled the core out, I want to make sure that the driver pins and key pins are oriented at a different angle than the springs and the drivers so that they don't snap back together until I make sure that everything's in the correct position. And I'm also going to make sure that I'm going to push everything together in a straight line without any twisting. Once I have the core inserted back into the housing and I've ensured that the front of the housing is connected with the front or the face of the core, I can begin to twist the core into place. Once the two sets of holes have lined up, you'll hear a snap or a pop and the pins will be pushed back down. Now all I have to do left is to close up the back of the lock, whether that's your pin style end cap, your C-clip, or however else your lock may be designed. I'm going to go ahead and grab that spring and pin and place it back in that hole and place my end cap. Then again, I'll need to take my turning tool, depress that spring, which will then allow me to twist the end cap back on. So it's important with these types of twisting end caps that you give it enough room so that the lock can actually function. If I tighten this down all the way and as hard as I can, even though the key is inserted and all the key pins and driver pins are in the correct position, the lock won't actually be able to open because everything is twisted down too tight. So what I like to do is I'll depress this pin, tighten everything until I feel the end of the threading, and then move it backwards about 2 or 3 notches. And then let the pen come back up, and that'll be its resting place. That way that there's some movement in there and I know that this lock is going to open when I insert the key. And that's how you repin your lock. So with these basics, you should be able to change out the driver pins into security pins, or remove pin stacks, or add pin stacks, or make any other modification to your locks. I hope that this video has been helpful. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe and turn on notifications. If there's any other topics you'd like to see a video for, let us know by leaving us a comment. Thanks for watching and happy picking. And insert the bottom into the chamber. Ugh.